probably know Toby even on a personal scale. He's the MPP for Norfolk. He's a resident and landowner in Norfolk and born in Port Dover, been here all his life. He's focused on issues of justice, social policies, and financial audits with a focus on agriculture, environment, and natural resources. He's the past president of the Norfolk Farm Safety Association and Federation of Agriculture. He's a teacher focusing on high school agriculture and environmental science studies. She was first elected in 1995, again in 2003, 2007, and 2011. He has served in Ontario politics since. And in the last election, I believe he captured 61% of the vote. He's been awarded the Canada 125 Medal for outstanding community service. Toby will be chairing the meeting tonight, and there'll be 4 guest speakers, and I think we're in for an informative evening. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Al, and good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Thank you to the organizers for pulling this together. They might be passing the hat later tonight to pay for the hall. I'm not sure on the logistics. I wanted to mention a colleague of mine, MPP Jack McLaren, came down. Jack, where are you? There he is right there. Jack represents Ottawa. Any other elected representatives or anybody else important I should ask to stand up? If they're here, we'll spot them anyway during the course of the evening. As Al mentioned, we got 4 speakers, 2 hours. We're going to squeeze questions in on a 5-minute break. I know Richard's going to hold up a card as soon as I go over my time. So we're going to try and keep the evening on time. And as you may know, if you have seen an agenda, our first speaker, Peter Hawley, the Frontier Center. Our next speaker is Elizabeeth Nickson. She's the author of the book Eco-Fascist. And third speaker, Elizabeth Marshall, Research Director, Ontario Landowners. And then David Gummett is
get some water.
coming tonight with the Ontario Trail Riders. So my role is just kind of simple, I guess. Thanks for asking me to chair the meeting. Actually, I'm going to do a little commercial. I left a newspaper article at the back. I've been doing a fair bit of work lately on the threat of Asian carp. And we're not talking about Asian carp, but there's information back there if you're worried about Lake Erie and our Great Lakes. And I left another newspaper column back there as well. I wrote a month or so ago just outlining all the outdoors and conservation organizations that we do have down in this area, and over the years we have been able to work together fairly well in the past. I've kind of prepared for this meeting. I've been reading 2 books at the same time, Eco-Fascist. I'll read maybe a chapter on this, and then I read the history of the Nature Conservancy of Canada. An awful lot of information in both books. A lot of good information in both books, and much of our goal this evening is information and education. So take a look at these books if you do get a chance. And I know much of the discussion, the issue is around issues of land use, conflicts around land use. We know this county, the boundaries were set out back, 1792, just south of the Haldiman tract that was established, again, well over 200 years ago along the Grand River. And over the years, there have been assemblies of large acreages over the years, going back to the early 1800s. 50,000 acres was set aside for the Six Nations Reserve. Many will know here, 1866, the Long Point Company purchased the point, thousands and thousands of acres over there. The government put together during the Depression the St. William's the forestry farm, a few thousand acres there. During the Second World War, we saw farms bought up here and there to set up the airports, like at Jarvis and Hagersville. Jarvis became the Esso refinery. Hagersville is now houses and some industry on that former airport property. The Birch property, I was just up there this afternoon. That old airfield has been handed over to Six Nations, actually, after the problems in Caledonia Six Nations. The Dunnville Airport, another day or so there'll be an announcement that's going to be a site for Samsung industrial wind turbines. So I just wanted to mention how land gets assembled and then over time uses change, economies change, and sometimes we end up with something different than we originally expected. I think of the thousands of acres put together for what is now the U.S. Steel property, and this would be the late 60s, early 70s. 1,700 acres was put together just outside of Port Dover at that time. Townsend property, that was about 1,700 acres. Was assembled by the Ontario government. South Cayuga, down there, there's 5,200 acres that was assembled again by the Ontario government. Samsung has the rights now for that area to put up not only wind turbines but solar panels, about 600 acres of solar panels. So we've seen some of this in the past, and we've got a bit of a history in how we address some of these issues. So it's now my pleasure. Is a card going to come up on me? I think my time's up. You got to be aggressive with those cards. You won't even stand up. Our first speaker, as I mentioned, Peter Hawley, as in Hawley Carburetor. That's how he told me to pronounce his name. I just met Peter yesterday. He's the president of the Frontier Center. This is a public policy think tank. Peter's based in Winnipeg. Deal with a number of nationwide issues, although much of the focus is Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, the prairie provinces. So please join me in welcoming Peter Hawley.
Thank you, Toby, and it's a great pleasure for me to be in beautiful Norfolk County. Of course, I'm from Winnipeg. It's -2 and it's -12 here, so I really enjoy being in your warm, beautiful town. I'm here to talk very briefly about the Frontier Center for Public Policy. We are a think tank based in Western Canada, but we are doing increasingly national issues, and this is one of them. Okay, here we go. We have offices in 3 of the prairie provinces. We've won several awards. You've probably heard of the C.D. Howe Institute or the Fraser Institute. We're something similar to that. And a few years ago, we were identified as one of the top 25 non-American independent think tanks in North America. And again, what we do is public policy research. You may have heard of sorry about this. Some testimonials on the Frontier Center. Some of you will have heard of people like Andrew Coyne, who actually comes from Winnipeg. He is a fan of the work that we do. Gordon Gibson, who is a prominent British Columbia commentator. And then the former finance minister of New Zealand, was he's on our advisory board, and in New Zealand, during the 1980s, they had to make a lot of big changes to public policy there. What is an independent think tank? And here we have some eggheads on a tank. We are an educational charity, so we have similar status to that of a private university. We cannot be political, but we have no government funding, so we are an independent think tank. I can tell you lots of government think tanks have received government funding, and of course, they will go with the flow, they will be politically correct, they will believe in all sorts of in-the-box ideas. The independent think tank is allowed to go beyond the boundaries and tackle controversial topics. We can't be political, we can't be partisan, and what we're doing is we're doing original research. We're very fortunate to be working with Elizabeeth Nickson. And I'd like to call it intellectual missionary work. We are creatively engaging the war of ideas. There is a war of ideas on the environment, for example. A lot of people believe in climate change and global warming. There are groups that question the science, and Frontier is one of them. We've had lots of interesting speakers at the Frontier Center, and you can see here we have everybody from Prime Minister Harper to Bob Ray to the former, Paul Martin. And so we are nonpartisan. We do not slot in with any political party. We are about better public policy. Our tactics in the marketplace. We use street-level language. We have a radio broadcast. We publish frequently in the newspaper. Anybody read the National Post today? We were in the Financial Post comment page. We also have a large internet site, and we do strategic partnerships with other think tanks around the world. We've done health policy with the Swedish think tank. And we're quite involved with some of the American think tanks on the issue of better environmental policy, which is our topic tonight. Our mission is to look at challenging ideas, to look at what's on the frontier of public policy, difficult topics. And one of them, of course, is the topic of smarter environmental policy. We're also in favor of developing or having a good environmental policy for Canada. We would disagree with some of the policies that are being brought in by governments across the country. And we have something called the Smart Green Project, and I do have some bookmarks here which talks about the Smart Green Project, and Elizabeeth's work is being done under the umbrella of the Smart Green Project at the Frontier Center. So what is the Smart Green Project? We are exploring how to solve environmental problems without reducing human freedom. We are basically challenging the central planning orthodoxy that we see in environmental policy, the drive to put people into ever denser cities and stop economic activity out in rural areas. We are also, as I say, we're also documenting the green political agenda in our schools. And for those of you who have kids in school, you will notice that they are being constantly shown things like outdoors movie all the time. And we are there to challenge that. And we are also very fortunate, again, to have Elizabeeth Nickson on board to develop the work from her book, Eco-Fascists. And I believe we have copies of the book here tonight. We did a study last year on the environmental state of Canada, and you might be surprised to hear that the environment is improving in Canada constantly. Conventional air pollution is falling. We have the second best water rating in the world behind Sweden. We are a world leader in forest conservation. In fact, the forests are growing across the country. And we also have cropland that is not at high risk of erosion. So the narrative that you hear out there constantly in the media is one of environmental collapse, environmental calamity. In fact, the the facts show that the environment in Canada is constantly improving. And Elizabeeth Nickson, who you've read her book, or I encourage you to pick up her book if you haven't read it. She is a senior fellow at the Frontier Center, a very experienced journalist, and a well-published author. And her book examines the unintended consequences of extreme conservationists and environmentalists, their impact on rural communities, and their poor record as stewards of the land they own. So, one thing I would say is that we are doing this work with the support of foundations. I would urge you, if you are interested in this topic, to contact me at the Frontier Center, and perhaps you would like to donate, support the work that's being done. And I think with that, I am going to make my commercial for the Frontier Center. We have a website, www.fcpp.org, and of course the Smart Green Project is where we are doing this work tonight, we're talking about it. If anybody has any questions? We'll move on to our next speaker.
Well, great. Yeah, thank you, Peter Hawley and the Frontier Center. We may get a question for you yet. You're going to leave right away. Our next speaker, and Peter made reference to our next speaker, Elizabeeth Nickson. Elizabeeth has lived on Salt Spring Island out in British Columbia for a number of years. A Canadian journalist and an author. For a number of years, Elizabeeth was the European bureau chief for Life magazine. And as we mentioned this evening, Elizabeeth has written a book. She's the author of the book Ecophysis. That was the book I held up earlier. So Elizabeeth will handle his mic.
Okay, so lots of people have been improving my PowerPoint over the last couple of weeks, and I let them because I'm not very good at it. So these are all slides that you know very well. Where do I aim this to make it work? Okay, so this is happening all over North America. All over North America. You are not alone. There are tens of thousands of communities which have experienced exactly what you are experiencing now. And that was basically the subject of my book. When I came home from Europe, I was a traditional, classically trained journalist. I was trained on the job at Time magazine, and I was thrown into every conceivable kind of situation. So, but I knew nothing about the environment. I thought the movement was probably a pretty good thing. So when I came back to Canada in '98, I started writing about it. And like any journalist, I would look for the weak points that made the story. And every time that happened, I would get blowback and hate mail and death threats and furious letters to the paper and shunning in the village. And that had not happened to any of the people that I worked with at Time Inc., unless they were covering mafia, at which point they were protected. So I was increasingly curious as the years went on, what was going on. So that's what happened. I found out. And the way it happened was that I had 30 acres, which I'd bought with a friend in England who had a stroke at the age of 39. And I had to divide off a piece of land to sell for him so he could have some money. And that's when I ran into the Islands Trust, which we've lost that page for some reason. All right. Okay, so the Islands Trust is much like the conservation authorities you have here, or like the Niagara Escarpment Commission, or like the California Coastal Commission. They are massively restrictive organizations who purpose themselves to become local government. And they slowly erode democratic principles over time. And they do it in a secretive way because they believe that we are collapsing biodiversity and that climate change is going to destroy the world. So one of the ways they do it is through land use. And what I discovered when I tried to take 5 acres off of my 30-acre forest on an island which is 90% under conservation, I reached this. Oh, this is my process map. It had 54 steps. It took 22 months. I didn't work while I was doing it because I knew what they would do to me if I lost focus for even a minute. I hired 5 lawyers because all the law is so new that I couldn't afford to pay for somebody's learning curve, so I would just cherry pick a lawyer. I hired 4 engineers, 3 surveyors, a consultant to whom I paid $110 an hour, and it took 22 months. And when I got through, I was told by the head of the trust that I was the first in a 1,000 applications that had been made. And what I was doing was entirely legal, it was entirely within the law. But during that process, the conservation community bent its efforts towards thwarting me at any turn they could. So what I did was I covenanted my ravine and creek, and I put a salmon enhancement project at the intersection of my creeks, which, you know, at the time I thought, well, that's really nice. And in fact, the Department of Fisheries dug my pond for me and paid for it, which I really liked. And then I built a greenhouse. It's a really pretty house. It has geothermal, it's rammed earth, so it has huge thermal mass. It costs pennies to heat. I mean, it makes, a lot of these green things make sense if you can afford them. And I could afford them because I sold my little house at the top of the hill at a once-in-a-lifetime property boom. If I'd sold it a year later, I would have been bankrupted. And most people, when they get involved with those processed maps, are bankrupted. So, as a classically trained journalist, as I was going through this thing, I was asking the following questions. If this is happening everywhere else, and from my desk on Salt Spring I could find out that it was happening everywhere else, what is happening to the human community? What's happening to the rural resource and exurban economy? And what is happening to the forests and ranges? And I wasn't interested in what was happening in boutique country, which is what I call Salt Spring Island. It's sort of, you know, rich urbanites who work digitally. I was interested in what was happening to people who feed us, who clothe us, who cut down the trees to make the wood that we all use. Everything in modern life comes from the country. What was happening to those people? Those were the questions that I asked. And what I did was I got into my red Jeep Liberty and I drove 15,000 miles over 2.5 years into America's backcountry. And I did that because as I did my research while I was going through this tortuous process that nearly drove me nuts, I knew that most of the ideas and much of the money came from the States. And it originated in the States. So now that 4th question, water it's just an impossible mess. The movement has made a mess of water, but it's beyond the scope of this talk. So the first thing that I found was clearances are something that has happened in history for the last 10,000 years of recorded history. When elites decide they want the land, they decide, like in the Scottish Highland clearances, they decide they're just going to move all the people who live on the land and work on the land off the land and send them off to America. Or the clearance of the American Indian was a clearance, the clearance of the Irish during potato famines, that's a clearance. And in the developing world, the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, and Conservation International have cleared 20 million indigenous and traditional peoples from their ancestral lands. They've cleared them into tent cities and refugee camps, clustered around the edges of their former homelands and promised that green jobs and green energy is going to take care of them, but basically they've abandoned them. And that comes from Mark Dowie, who is one of America's great journalists. He's won 17 National Magazine Awards. It was published by MIT Press, and it was deeply peer-reviewed. It was seriously peer-reviewed. Not like a lot of peer review, which is kind of peer-reviewed. This one was really, and there's a lot of scholarship behind that number. And it's more than 20 million by now. So clearances in the United States was something that I was really interested in. Could conservationists clear their own people off the lands? Yes, they can. They cleared from 1980 to 2010 40 million Americans out of ranges, farms, forests, all through America. Now, the thing about the publishing of this book was that I looked for a great publisher. I didn't want a good publisher, I wanted a great publisher. And because I worked at Timing, I at least could get in the door. So I found Adam Bellow, who has his own imprint at HarperCollins in New York, and he's Saul Bellow's son, which means he has a lot of authority. And I knew that Adam could get me the legal talent I needed, the copy editing I needed, the fact-checking I needed. A lot of nonfiction books are barely checked at all. They're just thrown into the marketplace and let chips fall where they may. This is not true with my book. My copy editor was a medical researcher, and every number in it was checked and checked again and checked again. And after it was published, they sent my statistical research to the National Center for Public Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C., and they looked at it and said, that cannot be right, and sent it to the USDA National Agricultural Statistical Service, from where I sourced my numbers, and they said yes, and in fact, as of 2012, it's more, and that I've done a very good job. So 40 million people. So in the heartland of America, this is what's happened to buildings. As you probably know, the Grange was the center of any agricultural community. This is what the houses look like. They're all just rotting away. That's how cattle and beef operations have dropped over the last, since 1988. That's how regulations have gone up. So they're all environmental regulations that have caused these clearances. And that was done by the Mercatus Institute, which is part of George Mason University in Washington, D.C. So it's a serious, and they worked from my figures. It's a serious institute. Not like me, who can't run a PowerPoint. So I used case studies. I would drive into a town and I'd walk into the mayor's office and I'd say what's happening, and she would say, and it was often a her, she'd say, we're dying here. What happened was 20 years ago, environmentalists came in town, we welcomed them, they joined all our organizations, they said we should preserve this, we could get money here, and we could get money there, and they shut down our forests, they shut down our ranch land, and we're losing our hospitals, we're losing our schools, we're losing our tax base. And Del Norte County in Northern California, it's on the Oregon border, was a town where they'd just done study after study after study documenting their decline. And they gave me all their studies. So the thing about Del Norte was the Redwood National Forest, which is, you know, a great iconic national park that was instituted in 1980. At the time, Del Norte was a working class county, but it was a prosperous working class county. Everybody had family wage jobs. Kids who were smart, who wanted to go to college, could go to college. They could pay for vacations, they could pay their dental bills. It was a happening place. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was functional. Now, what we use for clearance is something called social accounting matrices. So I explain this to my city friends by saying, if you take a small college town and there are 200 full professors at the college, you eliminate those professors, and all the people that support those professors all of a sudden lose their jobs. The families that belong to those people all lose their source of income. The town starts to decline. So those 200 people who run the mines or are in the forest they are the heart of rural America and rural Canada. When you lose them, you start to lose your town. So that's why closing down the spotted owl forests lost 10 million people out of rural America. In Del Norte now, 31% of the children live below the poverty line, and in the community right next to the park, it's 72%. Those are the family wage losses as they acquired more forest and put it into the park. They said that tourism was going to take care of that and replace all those jobs. So the National Park Service and the Sierra Club did big studies about how tourism was going to bring in all this money and and they presented it to Congress, and Congress said, okay, then we'll do that. 5 years later, less than 5% of that tourism turned up, and it has not turned up in the interim years. People come to the park, they stay 55 minutes, they get in their cars, and they leave. There's no money left behind. It's a total myth. And by the time conservation got finished with Del Norte County, they had 15% of private land to draw their property tax from to pay for their services. So people come to the county commissioners and beg for $7 an hour jobs with tears in their eyes because they cannot feed their families. So this is basically what's happened there. Their median household income doesn't look that bad, but the thing is that because Del Norte and Crescent City are so beautiful, a lot of environmentalists have moved in there, and they all make six-figure salaries. So when you balance it out, they're making a lot of money, and everybody else is making almost none. So the reason why is because all of these state agencies have headquarters in Del Norte, and all they do is regulate. They're always looking for something to regulate. So busy, 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 they got to make their next review, and what they do is they shut off the beaches, they shut off the fishing areas, they shut off the rivers, they shut off the forests from hunting. You can't even walk in the forests anymore. This is the federal agencies that have offices in Del Norte. So that's what's happened to, I would say, 10,000 communities across North America, courtesy of conservation. So let's look at how much land has been saved. This is another thing that drove the fact checkers crazy at HarperCollins. As of 2000, okay, there are 2.2 billion acres in the U.S. As of 2005, 473 million acres had been put into strict conservation. In 2010, it was 700 million. It's actually 800 million because even though the national forests are technically open for business, the movement will sue if anybody tries to open up a cut block, and will keep them in a lawsuit until they just give up and go away. Next slide. Okay, so as of today, the Bureau of BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, is going around the country locking down 213 million more acres, which will take it up to 50% of the American tax base, which is under strict conservation. Now, so this is what's left. Urban areas in the states take up 2.6%, rural development raises it to 5.6%, open space in the U.S. is 50%, and 1 billion acres have been lying fallow since 1950. Land trusts, though, they've done really, really well. Conservation easements also done really well. Private land trusts, 50 million acres they own. Doing what with them? What they do is they mothball it and the land gets sterilized. This is the Turner Foundation. Contrast that with the picture of the Grange. Turner Foundation is a primary actor in the endangered species scam. It's a splendid building though. Okay, so the most important important result of setting aside 1.1 billion acres of land is that commodity prices have skyrocketed. In the developing world, we set aside an area the size of the continent Africa, which is a truly massive continent. On all of those conserved acres in our world and the developing world, there are extremely valuable natural resources lying that nobody can use. The poor in these developing countries can't touch their gold, they can't touch their silver, they can't touch their oil, they can't touch their gas, they can't touch their forests, they can't touch their ranges. And we've done that to them. 600% commodity price range rise from 2000 to 2010. That's a Bank of Japan report, and it's worldwide. And in the last 3 years, that's how much commodity prices. What does this hurt? Who does this hurt? It hurts the poor, it hurts the old, it hurts young families starting out, it hurts people trying to start a productive business. Okay, so the reason for all of this is biodiversity collapse. And that is all done through computer models, like climate science. So there is a colossus astride the endangered species thing, and his name is E.O. Wilson. And his equation, which one of my helpers removed from PowerPoint because it was too complicated, it lies at the heart of every document that Sarah here or ESA in the States brings into a meeting room. They're using this equation, and this is the result of his equation. He believes that every year, 27,000 species are doomed to extinction. Every day it's 74, every hour it's 3. This is the U.S. Geological Survey. They also take this chart into every meeting room when they're discussing land set-asides and conservation and wildlife corridors and so on. And they say that as the population rises towards 8 billion, that many species go extinct. And they present this as truth, and that's why everybody's so scared. This is how we redid this. The actual extinction rate during the entire industrial revolution from 1500 to 1900 was 1.6 species a year. And since 1990, it's 0.2 species a year. That's the actual number. So of course, when the lawyer and fact checker and copy editor at HarperCollins got hold of this and read it, they refused to believe it. I had to source this so deep, but it comes from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and all of the science organizations that work on that. That's the truth. So, in the last 500 years, only 3 mammals have gone extinct and only 6 continental bird species. So that's the truth. The reason for that is that, I'm going to take this and when we're living in grass huts, the environment is really healthy. And as we industrialize, we create garbage, we poison the rivers, we toxify the earth, the air gets full of coal dust and nasty things. But then, this curve won the Nobel Prize in 1971 when it still meant something. And at a turning point of income, that starts to reverse itself. And around $5,000 per annum per capita, water quality starts to improve. And at a little higher air quality, because we can afford to demand that we do that we want clean water. It is the human thing. We're not all evil creatures who want to pollute everything. As a culture, as a race, we want to improve the water and air. And as soon as we can afford it, generally speaking, that's what we do. So as a result result, as Peter made clear earlier this evening, in Canada, the environment is in very, very good shape. We are in very good shape. We are, those few of us who are not sucked in by the biodiversity collapse meme, talk about peak planet, and already we're starting to use resources more efficiently, even in the developing world. We're using less water, we're using less energy. As we get richer, we start to consume less stuff. There's less garbage. We're getting there. The reason that we all get into these terrible tizzies is by something called the iron triangle, which I think was first, who was it that first identified the iron triangle? Randall O'Toole. And it's a triangle. It's bureaucrats, media, and politicians, and they operate in this triangle where they feed each other so that they can just make each other richer. And Richard Linson at MIT called it the iron rice bowl, because it means that you never run out of food because you're in this wonderful kind of quango. So scientists make these terrifying statements. The media picks it up and turns it into a catastrophe. And so people force politicians to make more regulations. And then scientists get more money. And then they make more terrifying statements. So this is what's happening in climate science, which is a very new science, and it remains untested, just as conservation biology, which drives the Endangered Species Act and SARA here. This is so interesting. What we're all experiencing, and on my island as well, is the imposition of ecosystem management. The thing is that ecosystems have never been found in nature. A perfect ecosystem does not exist in nature. Nature is chaotic. It owes more to chaos theory than anything else. It's ever changing, and that's why you can't freeze it in amber with exactly the right number of species in exactly the right order and say, okay, this is perfect. It's never been found. It never will be found. It's fruitless to try to make it that way. But we do have the results of ecosystem management, luckily. When Clinton shut down the western forest in '93 because of the spotted owl, the western forest grows 4 times faster than any other temperate forest in the world. So the Forest Service, which still has what they call old school scientists in it, have been auditing their forests as they changed over time. So the environmental movement, and because I live in a forested community, this was particularly close to my heart, so I really would go into the forest and make people show me stuff. So what the environmental movement does is they are basically paid to sue to stop any development or any maintenance or salvage or thinning or replanting of national forests. So if anybody tries to do anything, whether it's an independent operator trying to establish a cut block, an individual trying to cut down trees that are blocking up the sun in his house, they will launch a lawsuit. It's paid for by the Nature Conservancy or the Sierra Club or any of the 3,000 environmental organizations operating in Canada and the 26,000 operating in the US. And the lawsuits can just go on forever. So basically the forests are not tended. As a result, there are fire ladders climbing all the trees, and where there were once 60 to 80 trees, there are now 400 to 500 really spindly trees with weakened immune systems, and their roots don't go very deep, and they're vulnerable to pests and diseases. And so that's what's happening to the western forest right now. And the Forest Service thinks between 90 and 200 million are in danger of exploding in catastrophic fire. And that kind of fire, it's a canopy fire. It scarifies the dirt and the seeds in the dirt. It destroys the creeks. Even the dirt dies in these canopy fires. So what happens is the entire water system in the headwaters of North America gets completely screwed up. I don't know if any of you have been to the pine beetle forest in British Columbia, but it is truly a tragic sight driving through hundreds of miles of destroyed timber. The Department of Environment found a arsenic-based compound that could have limited 60% of the pine beetle's attack. But the Sierra Club paid for a group of physicians out of Smithers to sue even the testing of that compound. And so it just got out of control. And nobody has called these people to account on that. You can't do it because the hysteria is. So now the overgrown forest reduced water flow to communities, farms, and ranches below the forest by as much as 50%. Deadfall piles reach more than 20 feet high, creating barriers that forced large predators down into the human communities to look for food. So I was in northern Montana and staying with a rancher who had an irrigation lake around which wealthy Calgary businessmen had built trophy homes. And they called him one morning and said, there is this 10-foot-tall grizzly in our backyard digging a mammoth hole. What the hell are we going to do? And it's because the predators can't get up into the forest, so they're coming down into the human communities to look for food. The elk and antelope are going from central Idaho because there's been no clear cuts allowed anymore, so there are no forest meadows. All of that is happening. The Forest Service, who used to pay for rural schools, now loses 80 cents on the dollar, and the Bureau of Land Management, which did the same for ranching communities, loses about 66 cents on the dollar. Some people, they say that every forest has $5 billion in maintenance backlog. That sounds a little high, but I don't know. This really struck me, that in Yellowstone, which was, the most spectacular park, sewage bled into a native trout stream, and it required an act of Congress to stop it. That's because they are suffering from something that the agencies call analysis paralysis. Ecosystem management is so contradictory that they can't get anything done. And that went on for 10 years before they could stop it. That's how screwed up it is. So this is the money, which is, I always look at this and feel really, really depressed. Because there is so much money arrayed against us. The most interesting figure is number 4, environmental NGOs in Canada and the US. There was an academic at one of the universities who actually did the number crunching on this, and we used equivalents to get how much is actually spent in both countries. That is equivalent to an iPad being launched every month. They spent $600 million to launch the first iPad, and you remember all the ads about that. The environmental movement spends that much every month convincing us that the sky is falling. And they work at every level of government. They work at federal, state, provincial, county council, municipalities, libraries, universities, corporations. Every media level you can possibly imagine is just having tons of cash thrown at it. This gets into the Agenda 21. It's so interesting. The blue figures are the bilateral and multilateral aid the first world gives to the third world. And it's all given through Agenda 21 of Sustainable Development Rules, which are much like the rules that are being imposed on you here, which means that basically you can't do anything. So if you ever wonder why the developing world isn't developing, despite the fact that we give $70 billion a year in development money, this is why. So that red thing is humanitarian aid when there's a tsunami or an earthquake in Pakistan, and the brown is debt forgiveness. So the massive amount of money that's going to waste in sustainability is it's substantial. Okay, I love this section. This is mapping. When I first moved to Salt Spring, because I was writing for the Globe and Mail, people started talking to me about mapping and remapping and how important it was. And I thought that was something incredibly boring. But they started remapping Salt Spring and the Gulf Islands, and they did it in a way to get away from the notion of private property and towards what people really wanted the land to look like. And, you know, that they would sort of do colored rainbows and happy little dancing deer and forests and so on. And it was to re-emotionalize the land so that they could say, it's your land, so what do you want from it? Of course you want it to be conserved. So, this is sort of the basic map. That pale green thing is they want cleared of all people so it can be absolutely free for any animal and bird and insect and so on. This is the boreal forest of Canada, which we started to conserve in 2010 with the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement, which is considered a great triumph. Eventually, they want 50% of that under conservation. They started something new we discovered last week called landform conservation, which means the contours of the land can never be changed. And the first one that's being done in Ontario is called the Oak Ridges Moraine behind Toronto and Oshawa. That just is another level of regulation. This is the Ring of Fire, which is probably where the money to pay Ontario's debt could come from, but Bob Ray is regulating it. So God help us. This is a map that's meant to scare people about human-caused disturbance across Canada. I tend to not think that humans cause disturbance. I think they create bounty and beauty. This is the map of the U.S. It was voted on by the U.S. Congress in 1995, and they voted 95-0 against it. But everywhere I went in the U.S., they said it had already been put into effect. So the red parts of the map are no-go zones, no humans allowed ever. The yellow is heavily, heavily restricted and very little development allowed. The pink are Indian reservations, they call them in the U.S., and the green is where humans are allowed to live. Normal use, they call it. So wherever I went, in Colorado or Texas or New Mexico, they said that this had already been put into effect piecemeal and below the radar. So, fighting back. It is possible, despite the vast amount of money arrayed against us, and it's incredibly effective. The one thing that these people are afraid of is you. They are afraid of the people standing up and saying, we don't want this, because their ethical stance is that they're doing it for us. And if we don't want it, they have lost the first brick in their tower. So the Ontario Landowners, who I've just really spent time with in the last 6 months, are an incredibly fierce and effective organization, and I have enormous respect for them. They're as good or better than any of the Americans that have been fighting it in the States. Pacific Legal has won significant legal battles, and what you eventually have to do is take these people to court. We've taken them to court on Salt Spring, and we won 3 cases in a row, and it's like pulling their claws. And we make them pay costs, because they've never had to pay costs. The Pacific Legal Foundation won a Supreme Court case in Florida in June that said that no longer can a government agency extract land in exchange for a development right. That's gone in the States. So the 8 acres that they extracted from me for my covenant would have been illegal had I done it down there in July. Citizens Alliance for Property Rights on the West Coast is a very tough organization and wins lots of battles and does a lot with the science and with wetlands, because a lot of these wetland designations are fake wetlands. We need more media. We need more media on our side because they have all of it. Liberty Scene in the States is starting to do that, but